Listen, I need to talk to you about something that just happened in the NFL that absolutely nobody is talking about the right way. And by the time we're done here, you're going to understand why this changes everything we thought we knew about the quarterback position in today's league. This isn't speculation. This isn't clickbait. This is legitimate information from people who are actually inside these buildings watching what's happening every single day. And what they're seeing is completely different from what's being reported to the public. Before we get into the details, I want you to understand something crucial about how NFL organizations operate when it comes to player availability and injury reports. There's what teams tell the media, there's what teams tell the fans, and then there's what's actually happening behind closed doors. Those three things are rarely the same, and when you start to recognize the patterns, when you start to see the contradictions, that's when you realize there's a much bigger story playing out that nobody wants to talk about publicly. Now, multiple sources who have direct access to team facilities, people who are credentialed to be at practice, people who have covered this league for decades and know exactly what they're looking at when they watch players move, have reported seeing something remarkable. They've watched a player who's supposedly dealing with a significant injury that's keeping them off the field, but when you actually observe this person during practice sessions, everything about their body language, their movement patterns, their throwing mechanics tells you they're completely fine. We're not talking about someone who's moving gingerly, someone who's clearly in discomfort, someone who's limited in their range of motion. We're talking about someone who looks as healthy and explosive as any player on that field, yet somehow this injury designation continues to follow them week after week. The specific observations that came out are incredibly telling if you know what to look for. Experienced reporters describe this player as being loose in their movements, which is coaching terminology that means there's no stiffness, no restriction, no protective body language that would indicate actual injury. They describe the player as being light on their feet, demonstrating agility and quick twitch movements that would be impossible if they were genuinely dealing with the type of injury that's been reported. Most significantly, they said this player was dancing between repetitions during practice, showing personality, energy, and physical freedom. Think about that for a second. Dancing is not something people do when they're hurt. Dancing requires core stability, balance, explosive movement, all the things that would be compromised by the injury that's supposedly keeping this player sidelined. Multiple observers also noted that when this player was throwing the football during individual drills, the ball was coming out with completely normal velocity. This is absolutely critical because arm strength and throwing velocity are directly connected to core rotation and back engagement. When quarterbacks have legitimate back injuries, even minor ones, you typically see diminished velocity on their throws because they can't fully rotate their core or they're protecting the injured area. But that's not what anyone observed here. The velocity was normal, the mechanics looked clean, everything about the throwing motion appeared completely unrestricted. So we have to ask ourselves the obvious question. If this player looks completely healthy to everyone who's watching them practice, if they're moving without restriction, if they're throwing with normal power, if they're demonstrating the kind of energy and body language that suggests they feel great, then why exactly are they not on the field during games? There are really only a few possible explanations, and we need to examine each one honestly without letting our biases or preferences cloud our judgment. The first possibility is that this is pure gamesmanship, a strategic decision by the coaching staff to keep opponents guessing about their personnel plans. NFL coaches play these games all the time with injury reports, being deliberately vague about who's available and who isn't, forcing other teams to prepare for multiple scenarios and splitting their preparation time. There's absolutely precedent for this, and some coaches are notorious for using the injury report as a strategic weapon. But here's the problem with that theory in this specific case. If you're trying to create uncertainty for your opponent, you typically want it to benefit you competitively. You want your opponent to waste practice time preparing for something that's not going to happen, or you want them to be surprised when a key player they thought was out suddenly plays. But in this situation, keeping this particular player out doesn't seem to provide any competitive advantage at all. If anything, it hurts the team's ability to generate offense and puts more pressure on everyone else. The second possibility is that there actually is a minor injury, something that wouldn't show up visibly during practice but causes discomfort in game situations where the intensity is higher and the collisions are real. This is plausible because not all injuries are visible from the outside. You can have pain, you can have inflammation, you can have issues that don't prevent you from practicing but make it unwise to play in actual games. However, this explanation doesn't really hold up when you consider that the player is reportedly going to be available as the backup. meaning they would have to play if something happened to the starter. If you're healthy enough to be the emergency option, if you're healthy enough that the team trusts you could go in and play meaningful snaps if necessary, then you're healthy enough to compete for playing time in practice and potentially earn the starting role. The third possibility, and this is the one that makes the most sense when you look at all the evidence objectively, is that the injury is being used as convenient cover for an organizational decision that's already been made. Maybe the coaching staff isn't ready to make a change at quarterback regardless of how the backup looks in practice. Maybe there are political considerations, contract considerations, or simply a stubborn commitment to their original plan that's preventing them from making what appears to be an obvious move. The injury designation allows them to avoid the difficult questions about why a player who looks ready isn't getting an opportunity. It gives them a built-in excuse that most people will accept without digging deeper. What makes this situation even more interesting is the timing of when this injury supposedly occurred. Right when the conversation about this player potentially seeing the field was reaching a crescendo, right when fans and media were demanding to see what this person could do, right when the pressure on the coaching staff was mounting to try something different because the offense was struggling, suddenly there's an injury that conveniently keeps the player sidelined. Now, injuries happen all the time in football and timing can be coincidental, but when you combine the suspicious timing with the observations from practice that suggest the player looks completely healthy, it's difficult not to be at least somewhat skeptical about what's really going on. Here's something else that's crucial to understand about this situation. The player in question has a well-documented history of playing through injuries throughout their football career. We're talking about someone who's repeatedly demonstrated toughness, who's taken massive hits and gotten right back up, who's competed with various bumps and bruises that would sideline players with less competitive drive. So when this person who has that track record of toughness suddenly has an injury that keeps them off the field, but observers are saying they look completely fine in practice, the natural question becomes whether the injury is really the determining factor in their availability or whether there are other considerations at play. The upcoming game presents a fascinating dynamic because both teams involved are struggling significantly this season. Neither team is in playoff contention, neither offense has been particularly effective, and both organizations are facing serious questions about their future direction. This would seem like the perfect opportunity to evaluate young talent, to see what you have for the future, to try something different, because the current approach clearly isn't working. Yet despite all that, despite the low stakes in terms of playoff implications, despite the struggles, despite having a player who looks ready in practice, the organization continues to stick with the status quo. What's also interesting is how this situation is being discussed by the media members who cover the team daily. They're seeing the disconnect between what's being reported officially and what they're observing with their own eyes. They're noting the contradictions, they're describing what the player looks like in practice, but most of them are still being diplomatic about it, still giving the organization the benefit of the doubt, still accepting the injury narrative at face value even though everything they're describing suggests otherwise. That's how these relationships work in professional sports media. You maintain access by not pushing too hard, by accepting official explanations even when they don't quite add up, by saving your criticism for safer targets. But here's what we can say with absolute certainty based on the information that's been reported. This player was at practice, participating in drills, moving without apparent restriction, throwing the football with normal velocity, and displaying the kind of energy and body language that suggests they feel good physically. Those are facts, not speculation. What we don't know for certain is why someone who looks like that in practice isn't getting an opportunity to play in games. That's where we have to read between the lines, connect the dots, and make informed assessments based on the evidence available. The broader context here matters too. This isn't happening in a vacuum. This is happening on a team that desperately needs a spark on offense, that's already essentially out of playoff contention, that has a coaching staff facing intense scrutiny about their decision making, and that has a fan base that's increasingly frustrated with what they're seeing. Every week that passes with this player looking healthy in practice but not seeing the field in games, the questions get louder, the criticism gets sharper, and the pressure on the organization intensifies. What's particularly frustrating for fans is the lack of transparency. If the player is genuinely injured, if there's a legitimate medical reason they can't play, then be straightforward about it. Explain what's going on, give people a timeline for when they might return, provide some clarity. But when you have vague injury designations that don't match what people are observing in practice, when you have coaches being deliberately evasive in press conferences, when you have this cloud of mystery hanging over the whole situation, it creates suspicion and distrust. People start to think there's something else going on, that they're not getting the whole story, that the organization is hiding something. The receiving core situation adds another layer to this whole dynamic. You have talented pass catchers who are pressing, who are trying to do too much, who are showing signs of frustration with the offensive production. That's what happens when receivers don't have confidence in the quarterback situation. When you trust the person throwing you the ball, you play relaxed. You trust your opportunities will come. You don't feel like you have to make something happen on every single touch. But when there's instability or inconsistency at quarterback, receivers press, they try to force things, and their performance suffers as a result. If this backup quarterback does eventually get an opportunity, whether it's this week or in the coming weeks, they'll have legitimate weapons to work with. The receiving talent is there. The pieces exist to move the ball and score points. What's been missing is consistency, accuracy, and good decision making from the quarterback position, which are exactly the strengths this backup player demonstrated repeatedly at the college level. But you can't show those strengths from the sideline. You can't prove you're ready unless someone actually gives you the chance. The strategic element of keeping the opponent guessing about your quarterback situation only works if there's actually uncertainty about who's going to play. But when everyone knows who the starter is going to be, when it's obvious what the depth chart looks like, claiming you're keeping things mysterious for competitive advantage rings hollow. It's coach speak that sounds reasonable on the surface, but doesn't really hold up under scrutiny. What it really accomplishes is giving the coaching staff maximum flexibility to do whatever they want without having to commit to anything publicly, which protects them from criticism, but doesn't actually help the team win games. At some point, if this player continues to look healthy in practice week after week, if observers keep reporting that they're moving well and throwing with normal velocity, if the disconnect between the injury designation and the actual physical appearance keeps growing, people are going to stop accepting the official narrative. They're going to demand real answers. They're going to want to know what's actually preventing this player from getting an opportunity, because it clearly isn't a physical inability to play football. The reality is that NFL teams can be incredibly stubborn about their quarterback decisions. Coaches become invested in their choices. They convince themselves they're right even when the evidence suggests otherwise, and they resist making changes because it feels like admitting they were wrong. We've seen this pattern play out countless times across the league. Teams stick with struggling veterans when they have promising young players on the roster. They convince themselves they need to see more in practice before giving someone a chance in games. They create obstacles and requirements that didn't exist before as justifications for maintaining the status quo. It's organizational inertia, and it's one of the most frustrating aspects of how NFL teams operate. What makes this particular situation so compelling is that there's still time for it to change. The season isn't over. There are still games to play, and theoretically, the organization could decide at any point to give this backup quarterback a real opportunity. But with each passing week, with each game that goes by without a change, it becomes less and less likely. The window of opportunity is slowly closing, and if this player doesn't get a chance this season, despite looking ready in practice, despite the team struggling, despite all the factors that would normally lead to a quarterback change, then we'll know for certain that something else was going on beyond just injury concerns. The upcoming game will be telling in multiple ways. If the player is active as the backup, that at least represents progress from being completely inactive. It means they're available, they're in uniform, they're one play away from seeing action. But it also raises the question of why, if they're healthy enough to be the backup, healthy enough to potentially play if needed, they're not being given a fair opportunity to compete for the starting job. Being the emergency option is fine, but for a player who looks this ready, who has this much talent, who could potentially be a significant part of the team's future, it feels like a waste. The fan base is clearly ready to see something different. The media is clearly noticing the contradictions between what's being said and what's being observed. The pressure is building, the questions are multiplying, and the organization is running out of ways to deflect or delay. Eventually, they're going to have to make a definitive decision one way or another. Either give this player a real chance and let them prove what they can do, or commit fully to the current plan and stop stringing everyone along with maybes and injury designations that don't seem legitimate. What we're witnessing is a test of organizational philosophy and coaching courage. Do you stick with what's comfortable and familiar even when it's not working? Or do you take a calculated risk on something new that might provide a spark? Do you prioritize protecting your original decision? Or do you prioritize giving your team the best chance to win? Do you worry more about what it looks like to make a change? Or do you worry more about what it looks like to stubbornly refuse to change when change is clearly needed? These are the questions that separate good organizations from mediocre ones, was, and right now, the organization in question is facing that test. The next few days are going to be absolutely critical in terms of what information comes out and what decisions get made. Practice observations will tell us whether this player continues to look healthy and ready. Official injury reports will tell us what the team's position is on their availability. Coaching press conferences will give us clues about the direction they're leaning. And game day will ultimately reveal whether all of this has been building toward an actual opportunity or whether it's just another week of the same frustrating cycle we've been watching. This isn't just about one player or one team. This is about how NFL organizations operate, how they communicate with fans and media, how they make decisions about player evaluation and opportunity, and how they handle situations where what's obvious to everyone watching doesn't align with what the organization is willing to do. It's a fascinating case study in organizational behavior, and regardless of what happens next, it's providing valuable insights into how these decisions get made at the highest level of professional football. The truth is going to come out eventually, whether through actual game action or through the continued refusal to provide that action despite all evidence suggesting it's warranted. Either way, we're going to learn something important about this organization and how they operate when facing difficult decisions about their most important position.